Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays. Today's episode is one I've been looking forward to for a long time. I'm sitting down with the author, researcher, historian, David Fitzgerald, whose book, Nailed: 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All, has stirred up both fascination and controversy in the historical and secular world alike. Now, before you clutch your pearls or your study Bible, please hear me out. This conversation isn't exactly about bashing belief. It's more about asking how we know what we think we know and whether our historical standards change when faith enters the picture. David has spent over 25 years digging into the evidence, or lack of it, surrounding the historical Jesus. In this first part of our series, we're covering myth 1, that the very idea of Jesus being a myth is ridiculous. Myth number 4, that eyewitnesses wrote the Gospels. Spoiler, they didn't. But we didn't get into myth 7, which is the claim that archaeology confirms the Gospels. So stay tuned for part 2. And if you're a visual learner, like always, I got you covered. Head over to the episode blog for this one. I've added infographics, historical timelines, key biblical references, and a few comparison visuals that make these points click. You'll find all that linked in the show notes below. David has also written a bunch of other fascinating books that I have here on my shelf, including Jesus Mything in Action, that's Mything in Action, The Complete Heretic's Guide to Western Religion, and Time Shards. So if you want to dive deeper, definitely check those out too. Alrighty, without any further ado, let's kick off the interview.
Great.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am here with David Fitzgerald, and I'm just tickled pink that he agreed to come on. Will you please just introduce yourself to the listeners before we kick off and talk more about your book, Nailed?
Sure. As she says, I'm David Fitzgerald, and in that people know me at all, most people know me for being what's called a Jesus mythicist, and that's somebody who thinks that, and we'll break this down later, of course, but that Jesus didn't exist at all, full stop, no exaggeration. I don't think it was a conspiracy theory. I just think this was a literary person. So that puts off a lot of people right off the bat, and I don't use it to open my conversations with Christians, but I do think in that it's important at all, it's important for atheists and agnostics and people left of Christianity or right of Christianity to know. And just fun fact, it turns out it's not just Jesus that has a dodgy backstory. And we can, maybe if we have time, we can talk about that later too.
Yeah, it kind of fits in here in the opening context because I wanted to know, what sparked your curiosity about questioning the historicity of Jesus? And then I've heard you say in many interviews, because I've done my homework, trying to just read up on you while I was really enjoying your book. And you said that you met other folks from other religious backgrounds on a similar journey. So yeah, feel free to kind of weave that in here.
Yeah, it's very funny. So just a little bit about myself. I grew up Southern Baptist, so I was Christian right from the cradle. And long story short, around 19, and when I got into college, I had a experience, and it was like, wait a second, is Christianity right or wrong? And I didn't. It blew my mind. I call it my secular epiphany. And when I realized I don't think this is true at all, and so I was an atheist, a totally fine atheist for 16 years before I got curious to know, if you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're all talking about Jesus, but they're not talking about the same Jesus. And I got curious. It never crossed my mind that there was no Jesus, but I wanted to know, which one's giving us the real Jesus and which ones are just the legendary, can we say bullshit on this podcast? The legendary bullshit that came later and accreted afterwards. And so I started trying to figure out what was the real Jesus, the historical Jesus from the fake Jesus. And about 2 years into that progress, I started thinking, I'm beginning to think this guy didn't exist at all. And then, of course, found out I'm not the first person to say that. And there's lots of historians. Earl Doherty was the one who was the first one for me. His book, The Jesus Puzzle, really blew my mind. And then I met a guy named Richard Carrier, who's was a burgeoning historian, and we both bonded over, I don't think Jesus was real either. And so that was 25 years ago, and now here we are. And since then, I've written 8 books on nonfiction books on the subject. And long story short, I don't think there was a Jesus, but I kept, as a side effect, I would have Buddhists come up to me and say, it's funny, we're having the same arguments in our circles whether the Buddha actually existed. And what really blew my mind is when ex-Muslims would come up to me and say, it's funny, we're having the same debates in our circles about whether Muhammad existed or not. And when I heard that, I was like, are you kidding me? We've got his family tree. His friends and family were the first caliphs of Islam and all these things. And they started listing out the reasons. Well, actually this, well, actually that. It's like, oh, this is starting to sound a lot more like Jesus. So now I'm like a super mythicist. When I look at all the top 10 major world religions, at least, then I didn't expect them all to follow this pattern, but they all look like they're invented for me.
And do you touch base in that in the like Playing God series where you're kind of talking about that?
Exactly. Yeah. In that book, it's actually 3 books, but it's really meant to be 1 book. I talk about the evolutionary stages that all world religions, full stop, seem to have gone through, from like prehistory all the way up to today. And just like there's 7 or 8 major stages that if you told me about your culture, I could tell you about what your religion, or if you told me about your religion, I could tell you where you're at in your culture. And it's just very interesting to see how the idea of what a god is changes from time to time. A god or a goddess or gods, how that changes over time. Really fascinating stuff.
And how there's a lot of similarities. Like I just had a guest on that was talking about how she thinks consciousness leaves imprints or like blueprints where you can find these all over in different continents that aren't talking to. This is my dog Cashew.
Oh, hi.
And I thought that was cool. The concept by Rupert Sheldrake called morphic resonance. If you've heard any of that concepts, and he's got a book that I have coming now that is in his book, Science Set Free, talks about kind of the dogma in scientism. It's become now how rigid materialists can be when there's a lot of evidence mounting in science to kind of shatter the materialism paradigm, which I found really interesting. And that's Rupert Sheldrake's work. He talks about like PSI events, telepathy, and stuff like that. And
gotcha.
And he wrote a book, How Does Your Dog Know When You're Coming Home? And studied telepathy within animals and pets. And he's just like a really kind-hearted guy. So you might like his work. He definitely challenges paradigms, but that's what you're doing, you know? And that's, something that I wanted to touch on too. Like, why do you think, because the first myth we'll talk about, because I want you to give a brief overview for the listeners who haven't had the chance to read your book, like all 10, which might be a mouthful, but I've watched interviews and people in the comments were mad that wasn't discussed in previous interviews. So just a quick, just like in the front of the book, you list out all 10. You know what I mean? We'll just do a quick list of them, and then we're going to break down several of them. I did email you this morning because I was like, I didn't say number 5, which is how the Gospels don't align. That was probably my favorite chapter, especially when you mentioned John being like the MAGA Jesus, because that's what I've been tripping out so much in the deconstruction space. They're still using Jesus, but in the social gospel way while calling out Christian nationalism. I'm like, well, you guys are trying to put your authoritarian viewpoints on others. So it's like this, it's like you just switched hats. And and they got mad at me for saying that. I'm like, if we're deconstructing beliefs, we need to take a step back from all of these ideologies. You can pick and choose, but it was very fascinating to me to see how that unfolded.
And it's funny, that was happening right from the get-go. Even before there were people talking about a Jesus who lived on earth, there were all these. In fact, the further you go back in time, the less Christianity looks like anything we would recognize as Christianity. From right out of the box, it was a bunch of different things.
I agree. And that was kind of part of my deconstruction. So before we kick off into the 10 myths, why do you think this provokes such a strong emotional reaction, even with secular, atheist scholars like Bart Ehrman? He calls you a flat earther. And I'm like, bro, that's a little rough.
It is. And the irony about that is I mean, first of all, I love Bart Ehrman. I think for a guy who's so certain that there was a Jesus, he his writings about who he thinks Jesus was deconstructs myths about
They're
Jesus
monumental. They're monumental.
as much or better than anything. I think he's one of the best mythist writers out there. And when he realizes that, he may have a change of mind. But it's funny. He wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist? Where he's like, okay, I'm done with all this nonsense about Jesus not existing. So he set out. And mythicists like me, we didn't hate it because we thought he was going to agree with us. We hated it because we thought it was going to be the best defense of historicity and clear out some of the deadwood, like the people who think that it was all invented by the Romans or that, there's lots of crazy Jesus was a myth theories out there. But he wasn't even that. He just literally phoned it in. And I'm sure it was because he was in the middle of writing his book on forgery and counter-forgery in the Bible, which, again, is a brick of a book, and it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But it was obvious that he didn't think this even worth his time and attention. And what's funny is that in the books he's written since, you can see that things that he was saying, he was certain of in Did Jesus Exist? He's retreating and realizing, yeah, that's not so true anymore. That's not so true anymore. That's not so true. So who knows? We've been thinking, 5 years, 10 years from now, he may say, you know what? I don't think there's Jesus after all.
Maybe you guys aren't so flat earthy after all.
Well, and this is the thing. It's like, yeah, it's not a conspiracy theory. I don't think Christianity was a conspiracy theory. I don't even think the fact of whether Jesus existed or didn't exist is particularly important either. I don't think it really makes a difference. As atheists and agnostics, free thinkers, we can account for the rise of Christianity whether there was a Jesus or not. It's just the belief that was being preached. But if you ask me personally what I think, it's like, no, there's no way there was a Jesus. And more and more, I think there's no way there was a Moses. And there's no way there was Muhammad, Buddha, and for different reasons for each one. But ultimately, it's really interesting to see that even religions that I didn't think would fit the pattern, like Sikhism, which is really only 500 years old, I expected, I was getting ready for a talk, so I said, I keep getting approached by Buddhists and Muslims. I should just check all the top 10 or so religions and see if anybody else fits the pattern. And only every single one of them fit the pattern. And Sikhism, which is not even 500 years old, I didn't think it was going to. It so does. So does. Yeah.
Fascinating. And that definitely goes to kind of what we were saying about how consciousness leaves blueprints, or the human mind just has these narratives that are just like within us somehow that we have to work out the way we process the world.
And
That's
I think
very fascinating.
The way we think has a lot to do with it too, because even if you don't even go towards telepathy or psi or any of that, there's books like Daniel Dennett's Breaking the Spell.
Amazing book.
David Sloan Wilson's Evolution for Everybody, where you see that there's evolutionary survival mechanisms that we've had all along, ever since we were primates and earlier. And you see the way these different ones get co-opted by religions.
We talk about the righteous mind on every single podcast that I have. Have you read the book by Jonathan Haidt? It was like the best book I've read, considering I told you I've been on the left, I've been on the right, and helped me just understand why, depending on where I was or my context, why my morals might have kind of shifted. But a lot of that is moral psychology, how it evolved, the tribalism, and just how I really appreciated, because he is like a Jewish atheist himself.
Yeah.
He was able to articulate the sacred values and how he approaches religion. It almost like the book, writing the book, helped him have more of respect for it. And it helped me too, because I was deconstructing. I was very angry, and I was an atheist for a short time. Now I'm back to being an agnostic, which I like, because it's a less for certain, because I'm really not certain about really anything.
Yeah.
But I did appreciate that work, because it kind of brought me back to just appreciating the purpose that religions can serve, even if I'm really frustrated. Depends on my mood, my mindset, my hormones, on how I feel about certain ideologies, but kind of finding the appreciation.
Religion's never been just one thing. Even Christianity has never been just one thing. And that's something, there's a different Christianity, different religion for every single Christian, for every single religious person. We all share the same brain at the end of the day. We're using the same tools to find out truth. And I think approaching it with that kind of humility. I'm happy to call myself an atheist. I'm happy to call myself a not a Republican, and I'm definitely progressive. But that doesn't mean we are more alike than we're not alike, I think. And I think everything else, there's so much warping of manipulation of perspective. And it's funny, the things on Facebook that drive me crazy now aren't things coming from, it's not propaganda coming from the Republicans. It's a meme that I agree with, but it's not quite right, or it's taking a cheap shot or a little, and it's like,
those aren't helpful. I'm like
those
really
aren't
over
helpful.
those. Like, I'm really over it.
And it's like, that's what Christians do. That's what religious people do. And again, Christians aren't the enemy. Religious people aren't the enemy. Bullshit is the enemy. Lies are the enemy.
Yeah. It says in I think this quote you have in the very first, facts are sometimes the most radical critics of all.
Yes.
By William Rade.
Reda. He was German, so I thought forever his name was Wilhelm, but nope. Turns out he was a German named William.
Because I read so much, I always mispronounce things. My husband's so kind. He's like, "Oh, it's because you learn by reading." He doesn't tease me about it.
Oh, there's a Greek term that I've been saying wrong for 20 years, and only caught myself the other day because I heard it on a podcast. Do you mean pericope? No, it's it's the Greek pronunciation.
I think it's unfair when people judge folks for mispronunciation. I just think that doesn't negate their intelligence, right. And I think that's a jab.
Like you said, it means you read more than you hear it.
Yeah, and that's me. I live in books. So let's do a quick overview of the 10 myths, and I got them listed here. Do you have them memorized?
I don't, but yeah, go ahead.
I have them right here. Okay, so we're going to break down at least 3. If we have time, 4.
And again, just for the listeners, these are just, when I wrote Nailed, it's called 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All. But really all it is just the top 10 things we've been told about Jesus that just don't hold up. Whether Christianity is real or not, whether there is a Jesus or not, these don't hold up.
These are the 10 beautiful lies about Jesus.
10 beautiful lies about Jesus, indeed.
So the first one we kind of already touched on, but the idea that Jesus is a myth is ridiculous. And so if you even purport that, then you are already deemed not worthy. Exactly. Shouldn't platform that voice.
Exactly. I'm so glad to say that's changed. That I wrote that in 2010, and then I wrote a book. I got so much response, not from Christians, of course they're going to hate it, but from atheists who were saying, "Oh no, there definitely was a Jesus." When I wrote the follow-up book, Jesus Mything in Action, 7 years later, I didn't get the, "Oh no, there was no Jesus." I got, "Oh yeah, I never thought there was a Jesus." It's like in 7 years, that was the bulk of the response I got afterwards.
The Overton window does change,
Sure.
That's fascinating. And I haven't gotten that. Like, I get a lot of pushback, like when I've made a post on, because most of my followers are still Christian, so that would make sense. I know better than that. But so number 2, Jesus was wildly famous, but there was no reason for contemporary historians to notice him. So we'll talk about that, because I want you to mention the work with Richard Carrier and how y'all were comparing the evidence that we have for Caesar and the historical fact that he crossed the Rubicon, which had, outpouring of when something happens and we're going to have consequences of that. And so that's where we have lots of evidence that this actually happened. So we're going to talk about that. Number 3, the ancient historian.
Maybe before we read all, maybe we should just do a little bit.
Let's do it. I agree.
Yeah. Otherwise, I'll just lose track and everything.
Let's talk about that one though, because if we have coins, we have inscriptions. What are these firsthand sources we have? What does that mean?
Exactly. Well, here's the thing: for any historical event or person, full stop, whatever we're talking about, there's lines of evidence for that person or that event. But since we're talking about people, so for instance, in the Rubicon, crossing the Rubicon by Caesar, we have contemporary sources. We have his own writing on the source. We have physical evidence of it. We have just the brute fact that if he hadn't done that, things would not have turned out the way they did. And there's different lines of evidence. There's 6 or 7 we could dive into that we all have for this particular event. And we sort of have to judge everything in history provisionally, depending on the amount of evidence they have, the quality of the evidence we have, and what sources we have, and can they be trusted. So for instance, we have all these sources that the angel Moroni came to Joseph Smith, and that there's an ancient civilization across America. Do we have any other evidence for that? It's not that we have no evidence. Do we have any good evidence? It turns out, no, that evidence is not very good at all. And we don't have any of the other evidence. And it's the same with Jesus. It's we have not the best kind of evidence, but the worst kind. And we only have one. We have people who falsely claim to have been eyewitnesses for the most part, claiming that this happened back in the day. So it's not only just only one strand of evidence, but it's the worst kind. It's not his own writing. It's not an eyewitness. It's guys who are trying to preach a new religion, falsely being attributed as eyewitnesses, telling stuff that's not historical to sell you a religion. So
yeah, and we're going to get to that because so many Christians, and when I was a Christian briefly, I thought that the Gospels were eyewitness accounts. And that's what you were just saying, is that no, they're not. They were written decades after Jesus had passed. And so we're going to break that down in a second. But so when it comes to the lack of evidence, we have, like you said, we have Caesar's own words.
Yes.
We do not have anything from Jesus's own words, own mouth, which is frustrating. And we have Caesar's enemies. We don't, and so we don't have.
Oh, that's another one. Yeah, we have negative bias towards him. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's written at the same time. So there were people critiquing Christianity, or actually a lot of critiquing Christians, but that's not evidence of Jesus. It's just evidence that people believed in some Christ, which the Mashiach, which could have been a lot of different things.
Exactly. Let me jump in real fast with something else.
Yeah.
I get a lot of Christian pushback on stuff like that. It says, well, if you're going to throw out all that evidence, that means we don't have evidence for anybody in the ancient world. And it's like, dude, nothing could be further from the truth. Like Alexander the Great, they say, oh, well, we only have two things. They're written hundreds of years later. It's like, no, dude. We have two surviving things based on things that were written earlier, including eyewitness accounts. So it's like every time they try to push back in that particular way, it backfires on them.
If they're willing to stop with
yeah,
that's the difficult part.
Again, I can't emphasize this enough. All this stuff in Nailed is true, whether there is a Jesus or not, whether Christianity is true or not. I remember when I was a Christian, my pastor casually mentioned, oh yeah, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John probably weren't the real authors of the Gospels. That blew my mind back then, but I was still a Christian for years and years after that. But,
yeah, that really bothered me as a because I care so much about truth. I'm just like, it feels so hard to hold, hard to grasp, and it just felt so loose and slippery. I was like, I don't.
Especially as a Christian, especially as a Southern Baptist, we're always told truth, 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 defend the truth, die for the truth. Would you go on trial for the truth? Everything's truth, 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 and they never ask. And this is why this is true. It's always just buy that. Just click on the yes, I have read and approve of this.
Just agree to the terms and agree to the Nicene Creed.
Exactly.
And so you gave 4 reasons, and when you're breaking down, number 1 is Jesus myth ridiculous. And here you mentioned that every historian of the period, and that's what is so important here. We're talking of the period. We're not talking the next century. We're not talking 10, 15, 20, 30 years.
Right.
We're talking in the period. Every historian wrote about the Rubicon crossing. So you mentioned names that I probably can't pronounce. Plutarch, I can pronounce. Aben. Do you remember any of these historians?
It doesn't even matter. We don't.
We'll put them in the notes. We'll put them in the show notes.
I'm already biting my tongue because I know we're going to get to myth 3 or 4, and I'm like, oh no, save that for that. So.
Well, I think that was really it. Is that we just they myth 2 and 1 are kind of the same thing. It's like, it's not ridiculous to question Jesus being from Nazareth being a historical person because there are no contemporary historians noticing him.
Yes,
and you
learn more about that later. But there's a famous historian who died a few years ago, and he was he thought there was a Jesus, but when Bart Ehrman wrote his book, Did Jesus Exist? The book review that this guy Philip Davies wrote said, you know what? Yeah, I think there's probably a Jesus, sure. But here's the thing. Treating this idea as a pariah, as something that needs to be dismissed, it's like in any other field of history, the scene wouldn't even be controversial. He says, surely we can weigh the paltry evidence that we have for him to see if it holds up or not. So don't treat this like it's some crazy nonsense that needs to be dismissed. And I just love that so much. And for his part, he did so much to blow away our idea of ancient Israel, of what ancient Israel is. So it's like he knows about the biases that can happen. And
so easily with power and control.
And it's also just it's ingrained ideas. It's like 30 years ago, there was a guy named Thomas Thompson who wrote his doctoral thesis on what parts of the Old Testament are myth, and especially on the Moses and Exodus myth. And he got so much, it almost derailed his career before it ever started. And then I mean, for decades, he like had to paint houses instead of teaching history. But then, meanwhile, his idea in Europe became the consensus, and he got invited to Stockholm, and he had a very successful career. He still has a successful career, as far as I know. Even though the guy who turned out to be Pope Benedict himself said, "Oh no, you're not a Catholic. A Catholic can't write this." And it's like, so there's overturned verdicts like this. I mean, it used to be no one would doubt Adam and Eve. It used to be no one would doubt Moses. No one would doubt that there was a kingdom of David and Solomon. And all of those ideas have come into serious question. And so Jesus is just kind of the logical conclusion of that. And I would argue that it's not just the Judeo-Christian line that has these problems.
Yeah, and I think that the major issue is the Jesus Inc. I mean, the Abrahamic supremacy, I call it. I have issues with all three Abrahamic religions when they declare that it's truth, when it's absolute truth. So as secular individuals, we have to put a stop to this. This is why what goes on in the Middle East is because they believe they have sacred land. Religion is make-believe. It is myth. We're not taking it from you. We're not saying you can't worship. But when you declare absolute truth or biblical infallibility or just biblical inerrancy, some of these doctrines, they got to go. But then again, I believe, like I said, I believe in absolute, I'm a free speech absolutist. So I'm really struggling with my values and what I believe. And then the fallout of some of this stuff, right?
Yeah. I mean, I mean, we have to be for free speech. And the problem is you can't stop hate speech by anything but confronting it. And fascism has to be fought, and the only way you can fight it is by pushing back against it. You can't make people think. You can't make people listen. You can't make people accept any ideas they don't want to accept.
Right.
And that's a tough pill to swallow. But I mean, that's the world we live in and have always lived in.
The next step we were talking about was there's no second myth. There's no contemporary historians to notice him. And that weaves us into where you probably wanted to expand on the third myth, which is ancient historian Josephus, which is one of those big Christian apologetics go-to moves. They love to pull that card out. So would you want to break down, because that's a major claim that he wrote about Jesus?
Yeah. So in a nutshell, there was a guy in the first century, the end of the first century, I should say, named Flavius Josephus. He was a Jewish historian. He was a Jewish aristocrat. And in the 1970s, in the year 70s or so, there was a war with Rome. And halfway through it, he went from being a Jewish commander to switching to the other side and working for the Romans. So the Jews all hated him, but the Romans loved him. And after the war, he wrote a book. He wrote several books, actually. One about the war with Rome, called The Jewish War. And in this book, there's this little passage called the Testimonium Flavianum, meaning the testimony of Flavius, where he all of a sudden talking about all these sad things that happened to Jerusalem. Maybe it was Antiquities of the Jews. Anyway, one of his books has this passage. It interrupts all this litany of sad things happening and say, oh, and there was about this time a guy named Jesus, and he was awesome, and people loved him, and he did these miracles, and the people who loved him, it's a commercial for Jesus, basically. And then he goes back to all the sad things. And that passage and another passage about a guy named Jesus are the two things that get held up by Christians who insist that there was a Jesus, actually for anybody who insists there was a Jesus, because for the entire first century, even though these were both written in like the 90s, it's the only thing, it's the closest thing we have to a contemporary eyewitness to Jesus. There's nothing in the whole, during the time Jesus was meant to have been alive, all the way up until the end of the century. And then after that, we start getting more historical, quote, eyewitnesses, air quotes, to Jesus after the fact, but they're all clearly dependent on what Christians were preaching, going around preaching. Here's the thing about this testimonium. It's the most famous one brought up, but it's a forgery. And we know it's a forgery. And like everyone knows, even the ones who think, well, no, he really did. Even the ones who think it was part real, know it's at least a partial forgery. We have really good reason to think. For one thing, it didn't show up for 300 years. Christians in the ancient world loved quoting Josephus, but for 300 years, nobody quotes Josephus on this thing until it appears in one book, and one guy mentions it 3 times, and then it doesn't get mentioned for another, 200 years or so after that until Jerome. So like for 500 years, half a thousand years, one guy knows about this passage, and some of the people who didn't know about it were the same guy who gave him his copy of this book and who complained about Josephus never talking about Jesus. It's like, boom, I spent a whole chapter talking about all the reasons we know that Josephus never really spoke about Jesus. But at the end of the day, it shouldn't even be controversial. And the reason it is controversial, and the reason Christians dig into it so hard, is because without those two, one's a forgery and one's talking about a different guy altogether, without those two passages, they've got nothing in the entire first century to corroborate the gospel story. And that's huge.
It's huge. It's paradigm shattering. So listeners, in the podcast blog, I'll include just this eyewitness timeline that, if you don't mind, I'll include that in the blog. So you guys can look and see what we mean by, like, he mapped it out. We have the first century and when Jesus was alive. And then he mapped out when we have the most, like, the earliest documentation of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Doesn't even come until 94, 95, which is literally almost 100 years after he died. And so that is really the issue. That if that ends up being a forgery or not true, then now we're pushed back even farther to like the early 2nd century.
Yeah. And again, at the end of the book in the appendixes, I talk about Christian witnesses to Jesus that are held up as witness and non-Christian witnesses to Jesus, and explain how each of them is really either not, how they don't hold up to observation, basically.
Yeah, you break down the apologetics, like the typical Christian apologetics arguments for Christians who are willing and courageous enough to read this. And so definitely very interesting to see how critical scholarship looks back at some of these tried and true statements, and we can start to see the cracks in the paradigm, which is really hard, because I was going to mention the Jesus ink. The Jesus grift is real. Like, you can, my podcast was so much more popular when I was a Christian. I had 1,000 more followers on Instagram. Like, it's a grift. Like, and especially if you're somewhat in the conspiracy world, if you speak out against Christians, you will lose the entire sphere. And I was down to do it because, again, I believe we live in a free society. If that's true, then we should be able to talk about any ideology and question it from a kind of philosophical, kind of sociological stance. I try to stay nuanced and not radicalized, but crazy place. We should be able to just look at what's going on, what people are thinking. Like we've talked about Tucker and Candace and Nick Fuentes. If it's in the zeitgeist, let's just talk about it and not hide it. And just primary sources. Most people don't go that. We'll listen to
that too.
And make sure it's not being out of context. And that's kind of what we have to do with some of these historical evidence too, is like just make sure we're not having like your amygdala getting hijacked, which is like with the political stuff can do that. And you'll start to not be thinking with your prefrontal cortex. Yeah. And we all have this ideological kind of framework that will come from. So that's something I really check myself when I'm trying to engage with ideas that I might not believe to be true or good, but I'm just trying to find that balance as like my personal and conscious evolution in the world right now.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say to your Christian listeners real fast. If you're a Christian, Nailed will not say anything about there not being what I'm trying to say. All these things about that we're saying about Jesus are true, whether your religion is true or not. So if that makes it more tempting to you to read, give it a shot.
Well, how is that the case? Because they believe... don't they believe that Jesus died and was resurrected? And
but I don't think that's one of the myths. Actually, I tried to keep it to myths that are.
I see what you mean. It's only Richard Carrier. Well, I guess we do talk. You talk a little bit about the evidence for the resurrection being like weak. I think where there's a quote.
Well, there's that
from Carrier.
Yeah, let me explain. I mean, again, I don't think there was a Jesus. I don't think Christianity is true.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I want to hear that shake out.
I wanted to talk about the things that I was always taught as a Christian. And I really wanted to focus on the things that we always say that everybody knows about Jesus, and the major ones that are just flat out not true. Not true. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. So the fourth myth, which is one that I wanted to pause and take some time on for sure, is that eyewitnesses wrote the gospel. So you already kind of teased this, that Mark, John, Luke, these weren't the actual names of the authors,
Yes.
and that is shattering in itself. You mentioned how you felt when you heard that. Will you unpack that a little bit more? Like, where were you
Sure.
sitting? What day was it? Just kidding.
I was talking to my pastor in his study, and I think I mentioned I'd heard somebody say that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John didn't write the Bibles, and I said, "Is that true? Did they wrote it, right?" And he says, "Probably not. Just that casual, just that like not no big deal." And it's like, "Oh, okay, no big deal," because I figured, all the pastors and the guys had already done their homework, so it's no big deal. But that stuck with me for decades, and when everything finally came apart, it's like, yeah, let's revisit that. And it's very interesting just to know a little bit about the history of our Gospels. I mean, these are just the 4 that made the cut. There's all kinds of Christian writings going on in the 2nd century that did not make the cut, and some of them were much more popular than our Gospels. The Gospel of Mark, we're lucky to have it because the guys who wrote the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, they weren't setting out to write the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Luke. They were all of them setting out to write the one true Gospel. And they did that by borrowing from the first Gospel, Mark. And I don't know if I get into it in this chapter, but Christianity before this guy we call Mark wrote that book and Christianity after are 2 completely different animals. And that's one of the things that really struck me is when you hear about Paul and people from his generation, after the Gospels, we take for granted all these things. And we start our sermons by saying, well, Jesus did this and Jesus said that and giving the context for that. Nobody does anything like that before this guy named Mark writes his book, The Good News of Jesus, the Son of God. And before we go too much further down that rabbit hole, I should just say that none of our 4 Gospels claim to be eyewitnesses at all. Those names were all added in the 2nd century. And there were many, many other Gospels people could have chosen from. Those were picked and those names attributed to them. The fact that Luke is not somebody closer to Jesus or Mark is not closer is because somebody got all the good apostle names first, or Mary, or these other names, and that's what they were left with to say. Luke, in fact, starts his gospel by saying, so many people are writing gospels these days. It seemed like a good idea for me to go back and research the stories, how it was brought down to our generation and how it came down to us. And then that's a total lie because all he does is steal from Matthew and Mark's gospel for the most part. And then he goes off in his own direction. Matthew contains giveaways that he's writing after the fact because he says things like, oh, from the time of John the Baptist until now. And this is like 5 minutes after Jesus had a conversation with John the Baptist. Or he says, the Roman soldiers guarding the tomb were all paid off to say that his followers came and stole him, and the Jews spread that, and it's believed to this day. So there's parts where he forgets himself and writes things that like, I mean, we believe that now because I knew Jesus and he was my pal. See, but
it is funny because when you read them, as a Christian, you don't see this critically at all. It's only when you go back with a little more critical lens, you can kind of see. And I wanted to pause really quick for those who aren't we're theology nerds, but maybe not everyone listening. So before the Gospels, what were Christians reading? It was right because you said it was totally different after the Gospel.
Right.
So let's
maybe
go back.
Maybe they would say that for the Paul chapter. I think. Let's talk about when we get into Paul's thing. But I'll just say real fast, Paul, the author of the book of Hebrews, the way they talk about not just Jesus, but Christianity itself shows that there's all these different movements going on, and none of them are really, some of them like each other, some don't like each other, some
right.
say you're preaching another Jesus, another gospel.
Paul was really, we have the letters of Paul prior to the Gospels.
Yeah.
And so in those letters, it sounds like maybe it's a celestial person like Jesus. It doesn't actually sound like, we don't hear anything about his lineage. We don't hear about his time where he was born, the 3 kings. We don't hear any of those stories.
Right.
But we have there's a little bit of resurrection talk, kind of, but it's like as Richard Carrier says, that's the Jesus and outer space concepts is where he talks about that.
Absolutely.
So
and there's layers of heaven. But let's save that for the Paul thing. But there's so much we could talk about this whole.
But I just wanted to clear that up for listeners who might not know the trajectory of when because I think a lot of Christians think we literally the Bible fell out of heaven. and just landed. Like, I don't think they understand that a lot of people were illiterate. They couldn't read or write.
Yep.
They weren't literally studying the Bible. That wasn't what was happening in these ancient times. So I find that really fascinating and important. So did you mention, did we really cover before we move on? Because we're flying by. It's already been almost an hour.
I know, right?
What's this? We covered the clearest evidence that the gospel authors weren't eyewitnesses, right?
Right.
And mostly it's just because it's
I mean, none of them claim to be. They don't read like, I'm Matthew. Here, let me tell you about me. I met Jesus this day. This happened. But look, no, they're all writing in third person, and this happened. This happened. And they know what people were thinking. They know what was said in the Garden of Gethsemane when nobody was around. There's things that are just showing that these are fictional traits. I think the biggest one is that Mark, when you read his gospel, it turns out that everything that he takes his story from is actually taken from snippets of the Jewish scriptures, and it's all allegory. Everything allegory. All the things that sound like real historical accounts, like the trial and Barabbas and the execution. None of them make sense historically. All of them have huge problems, but every one of them makes perfect sense from an allegory, and we can get into that later too. Because as you say, we'll be here all week if we want to get through the whole book.
I mean, yeah, that's not, yeah. Ideal is for people to go buy the book and read it, because it's
There
not
you go.
fair for you to try to articulate all these arguments when you wrote a freaking book about it.
Yeah.
But we are
But
just trying to tease it out. And I didn't want to do a solo podcast episode on it. So because it just seems like such a big topic. So I was so excited to get, a historian, someone who's been in the trenches for over 20 years, kind of working through this. So basically, to summarize it, understanding the actual timeline and the questionable authorship of the Gospels is important. So that's how we can just change how we interpret these stories. We're not trying to take people's religious beliefs away. It's what you keep reiterating, right? Is that we're just trying to kind of reframe how we're approaching these. These aren't absolute truths.
If nothing else, you can say, well, this is why atheists believe what they believe. And again, you don't have to be an atheist to be a mythicist. Atheists will be perfectly fine whether they think Jesus was just a guy, and a lot of them do, or increasingly maybe not, So there you go. And you know what? We may have to make this a episode part, because
I agree.
think we're on myth 3 now?
Yeah. So do you want to kind of close it down with just covering myth number 5, which was what we kind of started off the conversation with, which was the Gospels give a consistent picture of Jesus, because that's kind of what started this whole process. So that way we can just close down there, and then and we'll pick up part 2 another time.
Sure. Yeah, that was like one of the big red flags that came early on, and really I could not get rid of that problem, is that the way they talk about Jesus, if you didn't have this gospel or that gospel, or if you had only one of the gospels and that was your story of Jesus, then you read another one and you realize, A, they both can't be right. It's like these family trees, do not add up. They don't even have the same number of generations in them, let alone the same names. It's even worse than that, because it's all coming from Joseph, for starters. They're not talking about the same Jesus. Jesus is just presented in different ways. And you can tell that they've all more or less taken the story of Mark and gone their own directions with it, because they're either in lockstep with him or they're going off in completely incompatible ways with it. And that's something to be said too. John, for every Christian who says, oh, but there's so many details, and we know that there was Jerusalem, and we know this was true, this was true. It's like, yeah, Spider-Man comics do a great job of depicting New York too. But the more, when you look at these details and then you compare them to the other gospels, first you can see the places where they're just cutting and pasting, and you can see where they're adding their own spin on it, and where they're going off a completely different spin. John, there's the first 3 gospels called the synoptic gospels, which means they're seen together in Greek. It means you can tell that they match up a lot closer than John's gospel does. John doesn't even try to match up the other gospels. He's got his own ideas for Jesus. There's no parables. There's no Last Supper. He just does his own thing. And his last couple weeks of Jesus's life is so different from any of the other gospels' last weeks of Jesus's life. And I just encourage people to read that chapter, because we could spend literally all our hour just breaking down all the ways that they disagree with each other and talking about the historicity of any of these events. It's like the problem's like, well, that couldn't have happened because, what Luke is saying here couldn't happen because it wasn't part of the Roman Empire then. So they couldn't have had a census, and Matthew couldn't be true because he's saying, well, this happened during Herod, and Luke's saying, well, no, this happened during this time. It's like there's no consistency. And again, the way they present their Jesus is totally different. Mark's Jesus is such a low rent, human, fallible, oh shucks, regular guy until at his baptism, all of a sudden God appears and says, you are going to be my son. I'm going to adopt you as my son. You're my son from now on. And what happens after that? He immediately goes to his job interview by getting tempted by Satan in the desert for 40 days, 40 nights. He passes that with flying colors. And everything in his gospel makes sense if you realize that Mark is just presenting this as a normal human guy who's just super obedient to God, and that's why he was able to work miracles. That's why he's able to say all these wise things. And his time in the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing that he's going to die, is so much more moving. There's so much more drama and passion when you realize this isn't some God just slumming on earth until time to go back to heaven. This is a human guy. All he knows is that God tells him he has to die horribly for the sins of Israel. And he has his doubts, but he powers on through it and does it. And that's a very moving story. By the time we get to John's gospel, John, I say I joke in the book that he might as well have a t-shirt saying, I am God. And why was he not blasphemed, stoned for blasphemy 5 minutes out of the gate? Because he tells everybody who will listen, yeah, I'm God. You see me, God, you see me, except, and they have nothing in common, those two gospels, not just from the way they present their Jesus, but the way he says things happened and the reason that he gets crucified. They're all completely different from gospel to gospel.
Yeah, that's what I found really fascinating. You say here only about 8% of John's gospel is parallel to the others.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I thought that was interesting. And another thing is right now in the zeitgeist, we call it low, and we, meaning a couple of my friends, we call it low IQ anti-Semitism when people talk about
yes.
the Jews killing Jesus and yeah.
It's always the Jews in the, it's never, yeah.
Yeah, and so, but what's interesting is you mentioned in the Gospels, they don't even agree on who killed or that was fascinating. Just the trials of Jesus aren't even consistent in the Gospels. And that, I was like, why didn't I notice this? Like, this was fascinating. When you're a believer, you're just so immersed in this, I don't know what that is. That
the official story, the party line of this happened, this, and this happened, this. But it's funny, outside the Bible, even within early Christianity, there was even more disagreement. And there were people who didn't know when Jesus lived and didn't know when he died and didn't know if it was Herod who crucified him or Pontius Pilate, and they weren't even sure when these guys lived. So it's like the amount of confusion. We have some people saying, oh, no, this was 100 years ago during the reign of Alexander Jannaeus. No, this was 100 years later during the reign of so-and-so. There was so much more uncertainty back when these books were written and when the Bible was first written.
And it wasn't until the Council of Nicaea and when those times when then the dogmatic doctrine had to be drilled in. You either had to agree, sign your name on the line, or you're now a heretic. And so,
and it wasn't even just Nicaea. There were all kinds of councils for all kinds of reasons all through the
prior to that. And then, so to summarize that, what you say in the book, you say historians do not take such liberties with how all these contra descriptions of Jesus that don't match up. Historians would not be taking such liberties with real people and real events, but storytellers and myth makers do. And I did appreciate that line. And so, we can pause there. The one thing I'd like to ask, because maybe the listeners are curious, and then I'll let you go get on with your holiday, maybe you're off work today, I'm assuming, like we all are. Yeah. What's the most what's the biggest pushback you've gotten, like legit criticism, not the ridiculous ones, but something that made you think? Was there anything at all?
Well, it was the gut reaction from atheists that surprised me the most, because I didn't expect Christians to love the book. But what really surprised me was how many atheists at the time, this is 2010, who said, "Oh yeah. I know he wasn't the son of God, but oh come on, Dave, there definitely was a Jesus." And it that surprised me so much. I went out and immediately wrote the follow-up book to Nailed called Jesus, Mything in Action, which was one book that turned into three books.
Agree. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a problem I have. And it talks about no, really, guys, and this is why. And I talk about Jesus in the New Testament, how he's depicted in various ways, and the different problems with that. I talk about Jesus outside of the Bible, and it's in early first century and other writings. And I do the third book is like a little imaginary time travel thing. It's like, if we were going to look for Jesus in our time machine, where would we go? When would we go? And how it kind of bounce around from there, the things you would encounter on a mythical time travel trip through the ancient Christianity.
That sounds fun. I have those three, and I also have, I don't have four because I noticed there's five. I have the Playing God book as well, the first one of that series.
The very first book in that series is actually about the Mormons.
Oh, okay. I saw that.
If you're out there and you hate Nailed, I think you'll like the book on the Mormons.
I'm sure. There's a lot of fascinating stuff tied in with how the Mormons and how they view they're like the lost tribe of Israel. And while I understand Christian nationalism and really Zionism being an issue, I don't think we talk enough about the Mormon church and how much power they have. They have more money than Pepsi, than some of these oil industries. I'm like, the fuck? All these people in the deconstruction space are like a threat to democracy. I'm like, I hear you guys. That's kind of what we mean by cheap shots, or like the No Kings protest, while Nancy Pelosi, who's a lifelong senator, I'm like, guys, the issue is the banks. The issue is inflation. The issue is so much bigger than left versus right. We have to snap out of that paradigm so fast, because I feel like they're both like tugging on us to like just basically wiggle to this technocracy.
Yeah, and meanwhile, while we're having our little culture wars, they're above it all going, yes, fight, slaves, fight. We're living in such crazy times right now. But one thing that gives me hope is that we're all in it together, and more people are united about that. In Israel, there's more Israelis hate Netanyahu and what's happening in Palestine than don't. In Canada, in the UK, anywhere you think about. I remember, this is going back to 9/11. The day after 9/11, there was 6,000 people protesting in Tehran, in the capital of Iran, against the attackers, against the attack. That never made it into the news, but it's like, there are people in most countries. Most people are good, and you can manipulate people to do things. But at the end of the day, we're getting smarter and smarter about pushing back on that, and recognizing that, the guys up here in the power, not to get all.
I mean, it shouldn't even be
about it, but
saying the deep state or like talking about that shouldn't even be like lumped into the conspiracy theory world anymore, because you can just see that with like the Epstein files, like and like we can see that there's blackmail and control going on, and it just doesn't matter. I don't really care what ethnicity is committing the crime. I just want justice. That's it. So if it's a Jew, it's a white person, a black person, like it's not about that. It's about the character. It's about the person themselves individually. So is there anything that you're working on? Like I'll let you go, but any projects or new ideas that you're working on?
I'm working on a book with a Canadian co-author friend of mine named Karis Burkowski. We're talking about the job that Christianity and the Bible have done on women throughout the ages. And so far the working title is Clearly Written by Boys, A Woman's Guide to the Bible.
Cool.
And it just goes right back into how these things have been framed to, in a particular slant, and the slant has always been about raising these guys up and pushing these guys down. And by guys, I mean girls. You can say that with white people versus black people. You can say that with Jews versus Gentiles, and vice versa.
I was going to say, because there are like female apostles, like Paul writes about that. So that's what I was saying. It's weird how when you study the early Christian kind of Gnostic time periods, and females were now, even in Judaism, like there are, Ruth, and there are strong female. I mean, obviously there's like a lot of misogyny in the Old Testament as well, but it's not all cut and dry.
There's like bad girls of the Bible and good girls of the Bible.
Yeah, that's funny.
Even the stories of the good girls, they really show, that's a little fucked up. That's a little messed up,
Yeah.
And the ways that they are. And hopefully it'll make people appreciate how Christianity, in now more than ever in America, is being used to like, oh no, women go back to the kitchen. Oh no, you shouldn't vote. You shouldn't read. Here, go make me a sandwich.
We've done a podcast on that because I got radicalized into that where I was Nancy Pearcey did her book, The Toxic Raw Masculinity, where she like misrepresenting is like, and I read it and yes, we've gone there. We've talked about all of that. We really appreciate. Would you have any idea when that book will be kind of hitting? Like maybe 2026 or it's still in the works?
26 for sure.
Okay.
We're fingers crossed it'll get done by the end of this year and out at sometime by August of next year. There's a great Canadian free thought convention called BajaCon in Sarnia, Ontario. And I really, really hope we can get it done before that comes out. That's such a great event.
Have you met Yasmin Mohammed?
We're friends on online anyway. I can't remember if we actually met in person or not. I don't know.
She might be there because she is from Canada. I've had her on the podcast, read her book. She's really incredible person.
Tipping her in front of the Tom. Yeah.
Yeah. Her book Unveiled is really, really good too. Highly recommend that. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us. And we will get him back on the podcast because we did not scratch the surface of some of the archaeology evidence and how there's no real proof. And that really pushes back on this Jerusalem tour. Come see the sacred, maybe there's some, maybe the wall. I love to talk about kind of that stuff. And again, not from a hateful way, but just kind of,
what's the thing?
I kind of mock the sacred concepts because Mormons believe underwear is sacred. They believe all is sacred. So I don't mean to sound like right now it's like if you say it, you're automatically a Jew hater. And I'm like, no, I just kind of a hater on the sacred concepts, but not really either. Just
it's a tricky balancing act when you do stuff like this because you want to. It's like the Christians always say, hate the sinner, love the sin.
Yeah.
Whoops, I'm sorry, other way around.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like I'm just trying to call out this thing and like you're the first victim of this. I'm not trying to make you the victim.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's talk about whatever religion we're talking about, but people get very possessive about their identity. You attack Christianity, you're attacking me. It's like, no, my dude, that's not what we're trying to do here.
Right. Definitely not. And I've been that person. That's called when your amygdala gets hijacked. It's called that narcissistic ideological rage. It's something that we can all relate to. And we try to challenge ourselves because it is part of that evolutionary moral psychology that Jonathan talks about in The Righteous Mind. So with that, we'll end the recording. And guys, stay tuned for part 2. And that's all we have today, folks. So David made a point to say that if any of you have questions, please let him know. He will try his best to answer them. He would love to hear from you. And I will have him back for part 2. We are just figuring out the dates. So if you have any questions or anything that you want me to ask David when I have him back, please hit me up, whether that's going to be on Instagram, Substack, X, any of those things work. Just so you know, I don't have those apps on my phone, so I might not instantly respond to you, but I will because I do check them regularly. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you and reading over any questions you have. And if you have yet to rate this podcast on Apple or Spotify, could you please hook a sister up with 5 stars? Nothing less. Don't waste either one of our times. That really helps. It goes farther than you know. And guess what? It's free. It's free to do that. You could send it to a friend. More importantly, just let me know what you thought about this episode or other episodes. I just love to hear from you. And until next time, stay curious, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. Have a good week.